We are back again with On The Money Line, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm your host Newsome, and we arrive at an absolutely stacked pay-per-view in Houston, Texas for UFC 262. This has all the makings to be an amazing event, which is headlined by Charles Oliveira versus Michael Chandler for the vacant UFC Lightweight Championship now that Khabib Nurmagomedov has retired from MMA. I love this fight too. Stylistically, it's outstanding. I think both fighters have paid their dues in this sport to deserve this opportunity, especially Do Bronx Oliveira. The co-main event is also absolutely fire, as we have the streaking Beneil Dariush versus Tony El Cucuy Ferguson, who needs no introduction whatsoever. I'm hyped. I can't wait. The only thing that worries me is the fact that we are in Texas, where there is usually controversy surrounding the judging, so it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. But just before we get into the breakdowns, as always, there's a few things to mention in regards to MMA Play 365. The last event was a good event across the board at MMA Play 365. The money back guarantee dog of the week was a tasty one at 2-1, with Michael Trizano winning a unanimous decision against Ludovic Klein. Trizano was also an official bet at plus 200, and along with Gregor Gillespie, that showed unbelievable heart and an even stronger second win to beat Diego Ferreira. That was another ticket cashed. We did drop on Kyle Dorcas, but overall it was a good event for us. Just to let you all know too, we have a competition running at MMA Play 365, currently running on Twitter, where we are giving away a 1-year subscription for both the betting advice and DFS advice. We will also be giving away 3 next event subscriptions in this competition too. All you have to do to enter is guess who will win in the Oliveira versus Chandler fight, the method of victory, and the round and time too. Just head over to our Twitter, which is at MMA Play 365, and see the pinned tweet to enter. Good luck. Remember, we have multiple packages on the MMA Play 365 website for all the UFC betting advice and DraftKings FanDuel advice you'll ever need. We also have various subscription lengths and options too, so to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAplay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights in the main event of the night for the vacant UFC Lightweight Championship. We see probably the best fight that we've seen all year. We've got Charles Do Bronx Oliveira versus Iron Mike Chandler. We've got Oliveira as the minus 135 favourite, the comeback on Chandler at plus 115 as the underdog. Now, as for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Mike Chandler at plus 115. I think that this fight should be much closer to a pick'em. I think there is an argument for Chandler to be a slight favourite as well, so that is where I'm seeing the value on that plus money. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think it's going to fluctuate, but I don't think it's going to go too far either side, and we have seen that in the current trend leading up to this fight. Charles Oliveira has been around this minus 135 line. He's dropped down to minus 120, minus 125, but then that money seems to come back in on him, so that's where we see the fluctuation. People do like the plus money on Chandler. It knocks the lines a little bit closer, but then the people that like Oliveira jump back on at that better line. Ultimately, when they step into the cage on Saturday night, I do think that the betting lines are going to be very similar to where they're sitting right about now. And as for how this fight plays out, as I've already mentioned, it's an amazing fight. Stylistically, both fighters are on form. Both fighters are coming off huge wins as well, so it's just going to make for an amazing fight inside the cage. And like I say, stylistically, you've got Chandler, who is a boxer wrestler. Then you've got Oliveira, that's Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's these types of fights that you just cannot wait for, and it's these types of fights that when they're fighting, you just cannot look away for a moment. Now, going into the analysis here, the one big question that I do feel you have to ask yourself is, where is this fight going to play out? And more importantly, is this fight going to hit the mat? Because those are really important questions. And I do think that we will see moments of this fight on the mat. I think we'll see moments of wrestling. I think we'll see moments of grappling. I do think it's going to be a true mixed martial arts affair, but I don't think the fight is won and lost on the mat. I think that Oliveira will find a way to get Chandler down, or it might even be Chandler just testing out the jiu-jitsu of Charles Oliveira. Maybe not early on, maybe in the second round if things are a little bit close. In the first, should it get past the first round? But ultimately, one way or another, whether that be Oliveira finding a way down to the mat or Chandler using his wrestling and taking Oliveira down to test him down there. I do think that we are going to see that in this fight. And when that happens, I do think it's going to be relatively clear that Oliveira is very dangerous, whether he's on his back or whether he's on top. But I think that the wrestling and the grappling of Mike Chandler himself will be good enough to remain safe on one or two occasions here. I think if he keeps pushing the ground game and keeps getting into dangerous positions, I do think Oliveira will find a way to submit him. But I think if he just does it once or twice, or if this fight does end up on the mat once or twice, then Chandler's not going to just get caught on the first or second time. I think it would take multiple moments and exchanges on the mat for Oliveira to find that finish and submit Chandler. So I do think Chandler's got the skills and the abilities, like I said, in the wrestling to create scrambles and to get back up to his feet. And Chandler hasn't got bad jiu-jitsu himself. It's not on the level of Oliveira, but it's definitely good enough not to just get whitewashed here. However, I do think that the bigger moments in this fight are going to take place on the feet, and I think that Chandler's very dangerous on the feet. One thing that really impressed me with Chandler in his UFC debut against Dan Hooker, bear in mind I thought Dan Hooker was a bad stylistic fight for Chandler, but the way Chandler pressures forwards and manages to cut off the cage of his opponents, get the angles right, make sure that they're not allowed to exit away, get back out in space, the way he pressured along with throwing heavy strikes and low kicks himself at Dan Hooker, who is notoriously a really good mover himself, it was super impressive to see. And the one thing that we have seen Charles Oliveira struggle with in previous fights where he's pressured, fights where you're in his face, fights where you're throwing hard shots at him, when Oliveira's allowed time, space and movement, then he can look phenomenal on the feet and his Muay Thai is really great. But when he's moving backwards, I just feel that a lot of his weapons are lost a little bit, and I think that's what Mike Chandler's going to do to Charles Oliveira. I think Chandler's going to be the aggressor. He's going to come forward hard. I don't think he's going to pay too much respect to the striking of Oliveira. I think his wrestling he can use defensively to keep Oliveira from trying to get him down to the mat if Oliveira shoots a reactive takedown, if he doesn't like the pressure. I just think that this forward movement pressure from Chandler, along with the heavy strikes that he has, again, before that Hooker fight I spoke about the power that Chandler has in his right hand, but now we know that he's got unbelievable power in that left hand with that lead left hook that he knocked Dan Hooker out with. So Chandler's got power, he's got that forward pressure, he's got that really good movement that I've already said impressed me a lot against Hooker, and I feel that this striking style on the feet is going to be the style that causes Oliveira problems. Oliveira, he has to try and tie up with Chandler. He can't just allow himself to be getting pushed backwards. But again, I think he might have some problems here in regards to physicality. I think inside the clinch, Oliveira with his knees and elbows, his Muay Thai style will definitely help him for sure. But I think Chandler's going to be the stronger, more physical fighter. So when you're looking at who's winning those clinch exchanges, and like I say, if it's Oliveira moving backwards that needs to be able to clinch up, tie up and try and get Chandler down to relieve some of this pressure, I just think that the physicality and the defensive wrestling is going to help Chandler keep this fight vertical and help stop Oliveira from taking him down. That's going to allow Chandler to keep this fight on the feet. It's going to allow Chandler to come forward, and it's going to allow him to land hard shots. And ultimately, I do think Chandler's going to hit Oliveira clean multiple times with hard punches, especially early on in this fight, and I'm just not sure that Oliveira is going to be able to take them. Dan Hooker, again, I know I keep going back to that fight, but again, another one of Dan Hooker's greatest assets was his durability. The dude had been through wars, he'd been hit with bombs, and he just remains there at all times inside the cage, yet Chandler goes out there and puts him down with what we assumed was Chandler's weaker hand. I think that Oliveira is going to get hit in this fight. I'm not sure he's going to like it a lot at all, if he's even conscious after that punch connects. I think if this fight does go longer, that Oliveira can grow into this fight. Well, I do think he can maybe look towards a plan B and see what he can do in regards to trying to tire Chandler out, maybe trying to get him down to the mat in different ways. And I do think that if we see a fourth or fifth round here, that Oliveira will probably look like the fresher fighter, but that's not to say that Chandler can't take 3 rounds out of the 5 should it go to a decision in this fight. But ultimately, I don't think the fight goes to a decision. I think the pressure and the style of Chandler is going to cause a lot of problems for Charles Oliveira, and Chandler's got devastating finishing power as well. So for those reasons, I'm going to pick Iron Mike Chandler to win this fight and become the new UFC lightweight champion. And in the co-main event, we've got Tony El Cucuy Ferguson versus Beneil Dariush. Dariush is currently the -185 favourite to come back on Ferguson at +160 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, honestly, I don't think that you can say the value is with Dariush at all. I think the value, regardless of what you think of Tony Ferguson right now, is definitely with Tony Ferguson at +160. The line has just gone too far. There's a lot of recency bias baked into it as well. So yeah, I think the value is with the underdog in this fight. As for where the line moves throughout fight week, there's been a lot of money coming in on Dariush over the last 24 to 48 hours. I do think that this will subside a little bit. I think we will see money come back in on Ferguson naturally at +160. Like I've already said, regardless of what you think of Ferguson, it's just a big number on his name. I do think the lines close up a little bit come fight night on Saturday night, and I think Tony Ferguson will go into the cage roughly at around +145, +150, with Beneil Dariush at around -170, -175. As for how this fight plays out though, the big question, the elephant in the room is Tony Ferguson washed? Is he declined to a point where he can't even compete now? I have been very guilty in the past of giving these type of fighters the benefit of the doubt. I've done it with Pettis, I've done it with Cerrone, and you know, the list goes on, and I've given them the benefit of the doubt and said, you know what, they've still got something left in them. But I do think that Tony Ferguson might actually be washed. Like I said, I normally give the benefit of the doubt to these guys, but with Tony Ferguson, after watching him get absolutely destroyed for 5 rounds against Gaethje, and then watching him just be comfortable losing against Charles Oliveira, and I'm not saying that Ferguson would have beaten Oliveira given more of a fight, but what I'm saying is he didn't give any fight at all. He came in there, he threw a few strikes, he made Oliveira's wrestling look great, which as a former wrestler yourself is extremely concerning. So Oliveira was getting the takedowns, he was getting on top, Ferguson was doing absolutely nothing, showing no signs of trying to submit Oliveira, showing no signs of trying to do anything in regards to getting back up to his feet to level the playing field and start fighting himself. So when you watch his last 2 fights, and I do appreciate that he was fighting 2 of the best fighters in the world, it just doesn't give you a lot of confidence that there's a lot more left to give in mixed martial arts for Tony Ferguson, if that makes sense. I think Beneil Dariush isn't as skilled of a fighter. I think Tony Ferguson is definitely more elusive. I think his striking's more effective, even though the technique might be slightly better on Dariush's side there, but I think that Tony Ferguson's the better striker. I think Ferguson's the better wrestler. I think the grappling's very, very close, but Ferguson definitely at least level with Dariush. So I think Ferguson's the better striker. It's just Dariush is a dog. He's been in dog fights. He's been put in bad positions. He comes back from these bad positions. He fights through weather in a storm. He fights through unbelievably tired scenarios where he's looking gassed, but he'll fight through it. He's got a ton of heart, and I think that's going to be a big difference in this fight. And looking at the way Charles Oliveira fought against Tony Ferguson in Ferguson's last fight, as I've already mentioned with the takedowns, I think Dariush could adopt a similar type of game plan here. I think he could be able to score the takedowns. If Oliveira could get him that easily, I think Dariush could get him that easily. And I think Dariush is absolutely solid enough in his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's an elite BJJ black belt himself. He proved that against Diego Ferreira. And I think if Dariush can get on top of Ferguson, he can remain safe, he can keep Ferguson down. And that's just one path to victory for Dariush. If this becomes a dogfight and Dariush just keeps closing the distance and getting in the face of Tony Ferguson, the fight does get a little bit closer. But again, I do think that Dariush could have moments of success there. But again, like I said, it would be a really close fight. The path to victory for me for Dariush is the takedowns, the top control. Now, the reason why I think the betting line is wide, because at the minute it must be sounding to you guys like I'm really high on Dariush, but the reason the betting line is so wide is because if I'm wrong, and if the books are wrong, and the people that are betting Dariush are wrong, that Tony Ferguson isn't actually washed. I think Tony Ferguson comes out here, I think he shines, and I think he absolutely puts a clinic on Dariush because he's significantly the better fighter. It just all depends on to what point Tony Ferguson is declined, to what depth he's declined, and how much he's got left to give. I personally don't feel that watching his last 2 fights, bear in mind I make predictions and analysis based on what I've seen more recently than not. I think that from the recent tape footage of Tony Ferguson, I can't say that this guy's hungry and this guy's going to come into this fight looking phenomenal. Whereas with Dariush, I'm super impressed with what I'm seeing. He's running through guys, he's looking great in his striking, his wrestling, and his grappling. So that's the guy that I have to favour in this fight. But if we're all wrong and Tony Ferguson isn't washed, then Ferguson wins this fight. I just don't see it. I'm picking Beneil Dariush to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Katlyn Chookagian versus Viviane Araújo. Chookagian is currently the -140 favourite. The comeback on Araújo at +120 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I once again think the value sits with the underdog in Araújo at +120. I think the line should be much closer. I do in a way kind of get why she is an underdog, but in the same respects, and I will talk about this when I break the fight down, I do think that the fight should be much closer to a pick'em. Now, as for where this line moves throughout fight week, there's been fluctuation on this line already. I think we've seen money coming in on Araújo, and then the people that like Chookagian have backed Chookagian back to the line she originally started before the Araújo bettors started. So I think there's going to be a lot of fluctuation throughout fight week, and ultimately, again, when these two step into the cage on Saturday night, I don't expect the betting lines to be too dissimilar from where it's sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out though, it is a really good fight stylistically, and both fighters have got serious skills. I like both fighters a lot as well. They're both good round winners and ultimately good fight winners as well. But the biggest thing for me in this fight, and it could be the difference between a win and a loss, is does Araújo gas? And this is something that's really perplexing, and it's really confused me as well, because in some fights she looks like she tires badly halfway through round 2, and in other fights she's got 3 rounds worth of gas. And for me, I can't really see or find the trend of what makes her tired or not, because in a lot of her fights, in pretty much all of her fights, she comes out with good movement, good head movement, she bounces in and out of range, and her movement's really difficult to deal with. And she also throws pretty decent numbers in volume. She also mixes in takedowns from time to time as well, and I just can't find the pattern of what makes her tired or not, even when you're looking at her opponents. Or her opponents clinching with her too much, her opponents shooting too many takedowns. Do her opponents have good movement, or do they have static movement? And is that the reason why in some fights she's gassing and in some fights she's not? There's not a real trend there that's very easy to see. So will Araújo gas in this fight? And I think if she does gas halfway through this fight, I think Chookagian will take over and win it. And I think if she doesn't gas in this fight, then she's a really bad stylistic matchup for Chookagian. Now, to be honest with you, I'm going to side with the latter in this fight, because even if Araújo does get tired, I think her style, her pressure, her forward movement, and the fact that she's got an ability to put her opponents on the back foot with landing hard shots, she'll mix it up between the head, body and legs as well. So I think even if Araújo does slow down and tire, I also think Chookagian, because of that style and because of what she'll be faced with, will also slow down a little bit. So I don't think it'll be a case if we see a completely gassed Araújo late in the fight and then a completely fresh Chookagian. It's not going to be that scenario. I think that Araújo would be tired, but so would Chookagian. But Chookagian might be the slightly fresher fighter. But Araújo doesn't gas to the point where she just doesn't throw anything. She just gets tired to the point where all that funky movement that she starts with at the start of the fight just isn't there as much. And that does allow her opponents to start looking a little better inside the cage. But Araújo can bank 2 rounds here before that even happens, and that's really key. Now, I do think that Chookagian is definitely going to have a moment in this fight, because she is a good fighter, she's got good technique, she's a good striker, she's got underrated wrestling as well. But I do think that the moments that she has are going to be on the feet. I think this fight is going to be won and lost on the feet. The thing is, like I've already said multiple times, I think stylistically this fight does favour Araújo. I think that Chookagian has had problems in the past with fighters that just get in her face, that can get past those long strikes, because that's what Chookagian likes to do. She likes to fight outside of range. She likes to fight long and just slide in and out of range on her own terms, which means that she's dictating the pace and managing the range really well. But any fighter that can get past that, make it ugly for her, get in her face and land hard shots, is always going to cause her problems, and we have seen that in previous fights. Andrade was a really good example of that. I think Araújo's got that similar sort of style, so I am going to side with the underdog in this fight. Like I said, it could be close. Chookagian is going to have a moment, but I think stylistically Araújo has all the tools to win this fight, so I'm picking Viviane Araújo to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Shane Burgos versus Edson Barboza. Burgos is currently the -135 favourite. The comeback on Barboza at +115 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, there has been a lot of fluctuation here. There's been a lot of money come back in on Burgos over the last 24 to 48 hours, but I still think that Burgos at -135 is the value side and is a better bet than Barboza at +115. As for where the line moves throughout fight week, I've just touched upon it. The current trend is Burgos. I do think that will continue up to around -145, -150. I think at that point, the line will hit a brick wall on Burgos, the money will start coming in on Barboza, it'll bring it down to roughly where we're sitting now, and that's where I think that both fighters step into the cage at on Saturday night. As for how this fight plays out though, stylistically, I do think this fight favours Shane Burgos. The thing is with Barboza, he's dangerous. We know that he's the best kicker in the UFC. He's got powerful kicks and he won't discriminate of where he attacks. He'll attack to the head, body and legs. So he's very dangerous in that kicking range, and his hands have been looking okay lately as well. He's definitely improving his boxing, but the reason why I'm not going to put too much stock into that is because we saw what Shane Burgos can actually take when he fought Josh Emmett. Now, in my opinion, Josh Emmett is the hardest hitter in the division, and the amount of punches that Emmett landed clean, flush and hard, where he put every ounce of power into those shots on Burgos, and Burgos took them. He did get dropped once or twice, but he was never unconscious, and even prior to being dropped, he was just eating these shots from Emmett. So I do not imagine that what Barboza is going to throw at Shane Burgos in regards to the boxing is going to cause him too many problems after watching him eat those power punches from Emmett. What Burgos has got to be really careful of is that kicking range. Now, any fighter that's predominantly a kicker and relies a lot on the kicks, the way to beat them is by having a forward pressure, aggressive striker that's durable, that will constantly be waving forward, walking through whatever you're giving them. And what that means is you're crowding the kicker, you're allowing yourself to close the distance and not give that range and space for the kicker to get off his kicks. And that's exactly what Shane Burgos is. It describes Burgos perfectly. Burgos will walk forwards at all times, no matter what you're throwing at him. He will constantly be aggressive, he'll constantly pressure, he'll constantly be throwing out volume. Burgos does hit hard, but he's not exactly a one-hitter quitter type of striker. He will apply volume, and this is a guy that's scored over 100 strikes in his last 3 fights. The dude's got ridiculous volume. Again, with that pressure, that aggression, I think he's going to be able to close the distance, and once Barboza can't kick him, I think that Burgos absolutely runs through Barboza. But Burgos has got to be careful in the early stages of this fight. Something else that does worry me as well is when some of these up-and-coming fighters are fighting stars, veterans that have been some of the biggest names in the sport over the last 5, 6, 7+ years. They can get a little bit starstruck. Some fighters, it actually surprises you with. You think, oh, they won't get starstruck inside the cage, but when they're actually in there, it can happen, and you do see it from time to time. So that's a little bit of a concern, and if that's the case and he does stick out in kicking range, then Barboza could absolutely knock him out with a head kick. He could break him down to the body and to the legs with the kicks as well. But this fight basically is reliant on what Shane Burgos does. It's up to him. If Shane Burgos does fight the way he should fight and the way he normally fights, then he's going to win this fight. But if he's sort of off a little bit, or if he is having a bit of that starstruck moment, or if he just can't find ways to close the distance for whatever reason, then yeah, Barboza's going to kick him apart and win the fight. But I think that Burgos is a tough enough character. He knows what he needs to do here. He knows that a win over Barboza is huge. We've seen Barboza struggle against other similar styles. For example, when he fought Dan Ige, I know people see that as a controversial decision, but Dan Ige had great moments in that fight because he was just able to close the distance and get inside of that boxing range where Barboza does have weaknesses, and if you are the better boxer, you're going to shine against Barboza in those spaces. I think that, again, perfectly describes this fight with Shane Burgos. I like the pressure, the aggression, the boxing and the volume from Burgos, so I'm picking Shane Burgos to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Matt Schnell versus Rogerio Bontorin. Schnell is currently the -160 favourite to come back on Bontorin at +140 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I think the value's with the underdog in Bontorin. I think the line's way too wide, and I think Bontorin is way more live than the betting line suggests as well. So I think the value's with the underdog there. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, there's been a little bit of fluctuation. Yesterday there was some money on Bontorin, but then it looks like Schnell backers have come back again. And what I actually expect to happen here is this fluctuation happening until maybe late Friday or fight day itself, and then a lot of money coming back in on Bontorin to close this line up. Ultimately, I think that by the time they step into the cage on Saturday night, I think we'll see Schnell at around -135, -140, with the comeback on Bontorin at around +110, +120. As for how this fight plays out though, the first thing to mention, really interestingly, is this this fight is actually at bantamweight, not flyweight. So for me, I think that favours Bontorin again straight away, because Bontorin is this short, stocky, aggressive fighter that you can tell he cuts quite a lot of weight to make 125 pounds at flyweight. So the fact that he's not going to have as much of a tough cut here, he's not going to have to cut those extra 10 pounds. I think that definitely benefits Bontorin as a fighter. Whereas Schnell, I actually think that this is a disadvantage for him, because one attribute, his best attribute in MMA, is his speed and his movement and his strikes. Specifically the strikes, actually, not so much the movement, but the speed in the strikes is absolutely phenomenal. So actually going up to 135 pounds, I'm not saying he's going to be slow, but he's definitely not going to have the speed advantage that he would have initially had against Bontorin up at 135 pounds. So the fact that this fight is at bantamweight for me definitely plays more into Bontorin than it does into Schnell, in my opinion. But stylistically, I think that Matt Schnell's definitely the better technical striker in this fight. Both fighters are really well rounded. Like I say, I do think Schnell's more technical though. He's more calculated, he's more composed, especially with his strikes. You can see him when he's given the time and the space, he sort of dips his head off to the left and to the right, and you can see that he's thinking and making reads and looking for openings and looking how to counter. You can see him work inside the cage and really think about what's happening, what's coming next, how to defend and how to attack. That's if you give him the time and space to do that. The thing is with Bontorin on the feet, he's not as technical as a striker, but the dude is a serious BJJ player. He's a great grappler, and the reason why I've just jumped on the grappling when I was talking about the striking is because it matters. Because he's a great grappler, he'll come forwards like a bull. He'll rush, he'll wing big, hard shots, kicks, punches, combinations. He doesn't care if you catch a kick and take him down. He doesn't care if he overexerts himself and you're using his forward pressure against him and you take him down. He will be so aggressive on the feet because he doesn't care if you take him down. And this is going to be a big problem for Schnell for two reasons. Because if Schnell does take him down, I think Schnell might get suckered into that. I think that Schnell would have problems with Bontorin. Even if Schnell's on top, I think Bontorin will find ways to cause scrambles and get on top of Schnell. That would be a problem for Schnell immediately. As soon as Bontorin gets on top of him, Bontorin's dangerous. He's a back hunter. He will look to sink the hooks in, take you back and choke you out. And you saw what he did against Bibilatov. Bontorin is a serious grappler. And then going back to the bull rushing on the feet, if Schnell doesn't decide to take him down and Schnell decides to try and brawl with him inside of that boxing range, then again, that doesn't suit Schnell. It's definitely favourable to Bontorin because, like I say, Schnell needs time, space and movement to be that great striker that he is. And I've just been a little underwhelmed with Matt Schnell lately. Like his last fight against Tyson Nam, he should have been the better technical striker. He should have been the fighter that has way more volume, that has better movement, and it should have been a fight where Matt Schnell looked great against Nam. And I'm not disrespecting Nam. Nam's got his own skill set, he's got his own qualities, he's got his own style, but stylistically, that should have been a fight that Matt Schnell looked amazing in. And actually, he won a split decision, but he nearly threw the fight away in a fight that should have been a great fight for him. So, like I say, I'm just a little underwhelmed with Schnell. I do think that Bontorin, his forward pressure, his aggression, the fact that he's going to wing shots, make life uncomfortable for Schnell. He'll also even shoot his own takedowns. I think that Bontorin's got multiple paths to victory here because with his striking, I feel it's underrated, and I think he would be able to hang with Schnell inside the cage as long as he's not on the outside. I think if Bontorin sticks on the outside, then he's probably going to get pieced up by the more calculated technical striker that Schnell is. But then again, I said the same thing with the Tyson Nam fight, and that ended up in a close split decision. So I think Bontorin has definitely got skills and qualities on the feet to make this fight dirty, to make it ugly, to make it uncomfortable for Schnell. And then I think that he's got the path to victory on the mat as well if he can get on top, or even if he can force Schnell to take him down and try and cause scrambles, hit a sweep and reversal and get on top of Schnell. I think that Bontorin's the better grappler. I think the striking's close. Bontorin's not the more technical striker, but he's going to be the more effective striker because of the way he pressures and his aggression as well. For those reasons, I do feel that Bontorin has multiple ways to win this fight, and I'm picking Rogerio Bontorin to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is a phenomenal fight. We've got Ronaldo Jacare Souza versus Andre Muniz. The fight is a dead even -110 pick'em on either side on the betting line. As for where the value is there, I feel if you've got a good read, both sides are playable. I think both sides is live as well. So if you've got a good read, the -110 can be played on either side. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, there has been a little bit of fluctuation, a little bit of money come back in on Jacare, pushing Jacare to the slight favourite. Then a little bit of money came in on Muniz, pushing it back to a pick'em. Then a little bit more money came in on Muniz, pushing him to the slight favourite. favourite. Now it's back at a pick'em, so I feel like we're going to get this throughout fight week, and I do think that by the time they step into the cage, it could be a -110 pick'em on either side. But if one side is going to be the slight favourite, I probably would edge towards Jacare just because of the name value. And I think once the more casual market starts coming into this on Saturday to look to place the bets, they're just going to recognise that name of Jacare opposed to Muniz. So it could be a -110 pick'em on either side, but if not, then I do think Jacare would be the slight favourite. Now, as for how this fight plays out, the fight's going to be a good fight and it's going to be close because both fighters are predominantly BJJ aces. Both fighters are so strong on the mat grappling. Now, the thing is with these type of fights, it's normally the fighter that gets on top that's going to be the more effective fighter, because although I don't think that either fighter will be easily able to find a submission, I think both fighters are good enough that if they're on top, they're not going to make any mistakes, or they're not going to allow their opponent to sweep or reverse from bottom. So ultimately, the first fighter to get on top is likely going to be the fighter doing the best work. And when you look at it from that perspective, I do think you then look at the wrestling and whose wrestling's better, because that's going to be the fighter that's more likely to get on top and be that controlling force. And I think that the wrestling of Jacare is better than the wrestling of Muniz offensively. I think that Jacare can score takedowns. He will look for a single leg, he will look for a double leg, or he'll body lock and look to drag his opponents down to the mat. And he is a big, physically strong fighter as well, but so's Muniz. I don't think Muniz is going to get taken down easily, but I do think that when you look at the wrestling of both of these fighters, Jacare does have an edge there. So I feel that if any fighter's going to get on top, it's probably going to be Jacare, and then Jacare will be able to do work on top relatively safely. I don't think Muniz is going to catch him in a triangle or an armbar. Jacare is just too good for that, but I also think that Jacare is good enough to stop Muniz from getting back up to his feet easily anyway, and if he does, he might be able to score another takedown with chain wrestling once Muniz has stood back up. But another way to look at this fight is a lot of these times when you get BJJ ace versus BJJ ace, just like when you get wrestler versus wrestler, these fights predominantly take place on the feet. So when you look at the striking of both fighters, again, it's very close. I do have concerns of the cardio of Jacare in general. I think that although we have seen Muniz tire, I think Muniz could look the fresher fighter in a striking battle over 3 rounds, but Jacare again for me is the more effective striker. He's the fighter that's more likely to move forward. He'll just pop a nice jab out there, or he'll just consistently throw the straight right hand and just really look to be consistent with those types of strikes. And Muniz on the other hand, he isn't going to start coming in with combinations, with fast combinations, ripping to the head and the body. So I think when you look at effective striking, again, I give Jacare a slight edge there as well. So I am leaning towards Jacare in this fight. I think he's the slightly better striker. I think he's definitely the better wrestler. Because of that, he should be the one that's in top position more often than what Muniz is. I think Muniz would struggle to get Jacare down, but again, if Muniz does get him down, then I think Muniz will be able to win minutes on top, establish a good top position and potentially take rounds. I just see the more likely fighter to be on top being Jacare. If this fight does go late, as I've already mentioned, I do have slight concerns over the cardio of Jacare, so it wouldn't shock me to see Muniz take over the fight and look better the longer the fight goes on. But at that point, Jacare might have already banked himself 2 rounds, and as long as he doesn't get finished in that 3rd round, he wins the decision, unless obviously Muniz finishes. But I think overall Jacare just is the slightly better fighter, slightly better striker, better wrestler. I think he's going to be fine in top position against Muniz as well, and for those reasons I'm picking Ronaldo Jacare Souza to win this fight. And in the next fight we've got Mike Grundy versus Lando Vannata. Grundy is currently the -120 favourite. The comeback on Vannata at +100 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I think it's one of these fights again where if you've got a good read on either side, actually either side's playable. Even though Grundy is -120, it's not a -110 pick 'em on either side. But if you've got a good read on Grundy, that side's playable. And the same for Vannata at +100. If you like Vannata and you've got a good read there, then that's obviously absolutely playable as well. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think we're going to see some fluctuation. We did see this fight go to a -110 pick'em a couple of days ago. Now money's come back in on Grundy a little bit, pushed him to the slight favourite, and I think we see that fluctuation throughout fight week. Ultimately, when they step into the cage on Saturday night, I do think Grundy will be around that -120, -125 line, with Vannata at +100, +105. But as for how this fight plays out, the problem I've got with Vannata is he's so inconsistent with his performances, whether he wins, loses or draws. Some fights he looks really great, some fights he looks really flat, some fights he starts fast, gases late. Some fights he starts slow, comes on stronger. He's just really inconsistent with his performances, and he is a good fighter. It's just I don't feel that he's as explosive and he's as elusive as what he used to be. And the thing is with Grundy, although his striking can be effective, we saw him do good work against Narimani, we saw him parts against Evloev, who is a phenomenal talent. He had good moments against him, but Grundy isn't the technical striker that Vannata is. But even with this being said, if this fight is a 15-minute kickboxing fight, I do think that it's going to be relatively close, because as I've already mentioned, even though Vannata is the more technical striker, Grundy's quite effective with the boxing. He comes forward nicely, he's got nice pressure, and he will throw straight, hard punches, and he'll keep consistent with them punches as well, and he's quite accurate as well watching that. But it's going to be close, because if Vannata does turn it on, he's more versatile, he's got more weapons in the arsenal to use with his kicks up and down the body, then he'll mix his punches in with combinations. But then when Vannata does slow down a little bit, he'll turn into a bit of a counter striker, and he'll counter with a big hard right hand, so he's dangerous. So whichever way you look at this from the striking department, the fight's going to be relatively close. However, where Grundy shines is in the wrestling and the grappling. Now, Vannata also has a wrestling background. Grundy has a wrestling background, but I think offensively, Grundy is the better wrestler in MMA. I think if anybody is scoring takedowns in this fight, it is going to be Grundy trying to take Vannata down. And then the one big concern I've got for Vannata is he's not going to get absolutely drowned on with Grundy on top of him. He'll be able to do a little bit of work. He might be able to get back up to his feet. But the problem with Vannata getting back up to his feet, especially in the open cage, is I think he's going to give Grundy an opportunity to get a front choke. Vannata likes to turn onto his knees and get into that front choke position to try and stand up that way, but Grundy's got really good chokes from that front position, anaconda chokes, Darce chokes. He'll really try and lock something up, and he's got a very tight grip. He nearly submitted Movsar Evloev to the point where I thought Evloev was going to sleep because he didn't tap. You could see the grimace on his face, and that would have been an insane win for Grundy to finish and submit somebody like Evloev. So I feel that if Vannata is trying to get back up, he is probably going to expose his neck at some point, and that's going to give Grundy an opportunity to finish. So that's definitely something that Grundy needs to watch out for and look to capitalise on if Vannata does that. I think the striking is going to be close here, but I think the offensive wrestling of Grundy is going to add an extra element to this fight, and I think that Grundy could potentially finish Vannata via submission if Vannata is lazy in regards to how he's getting up. The fight's going to be close, but I do edge Grundy because I think he's got more variables in this fight to look good in regards to, like I said, the wrestling and the grappling. So it's for those reasons that I'm picking Mike Grundy to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Andrea Lee versus Antonina Shevchenko. Shevchenko is currently the -125 favourite. The comeback on Lee at +105 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think that this line should be much closer. It should be much closer to a pick'em. So for that reason, I think the +105 line on Andrea Lee is the value side in this fight. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, all the money's been coming in on Andrea Lee. Shevchenko opened at -195. She sits at -125. That tells you exactly what you need to know about that line movement. But I do think the movement is going to stop a little bit in regards to how rapid that was right now. It wouldn't shock me to see a -110 pick'em on either side by the time they both stepped in the cage, but I think the drastic line movements have come to a halt, and it'll just be little fluctuations here and there. Now, as for how this fight plays out, Andrea Lee, again, she's been a fighter that's been really underwhelming in the last few fights. She's on a 3-fight losing streak now. She didn't look great against Roxanne Modafferi in her last fight. The fight before that, to her credit, I do think she was robbed. I think that she clearly won that fight. Ironically, that fight was in Texas, so again, leading back to what I mentioned in the introduction about the judging, it's going to be really interesting. But I think that overall, Andrea Lee's game is more versatile and more effective than Shevchenko's. Now, Shevchenko is showing improvements, especially in the wrestling and the top control. We saw in the last fight against Lipski. I bet Shevchenko there as a -150 favourite. I didn't expect her to win in that way. I thought she was going to piece Lipski up on the feet, keep the fight vertical and win that way. But she didn't. She went on top of Lipski and looked great in doing so. So she's clearly showing developments in a game, and that's something that cannot be ignored in this fight. But with that being said, somebody like Andrea Lee, when she's on a game, she's aggressive. She'll come forward. She'll throw a lot of strikes. She'll throw in volume, in combinations. She'll mix to the body and head. And if she can get on top of her opponent, she is actually quite lethal once she starts raining down the ground and pound, and those big loud grunts coming from top control. So Andrea Lee, overall as an MMA fighter, I think she is more well-rounded, and I think she is great in more areas than what Shevchenko is. I think Shevchenko can get a little stuck when she's on her back. But listen, if Shevchenko shows further wrestling and grappling improvement and comes and takes Andrea Lee down, Andrea Lee, I think, has similar problems on her back as what Shevchenko has on her back. So ultimately, similar to what I said with Jacare Muniz, I think whichever one of these fighters gets on top is likely the fighter that's going to be doing the best work. On the feet, I think Shevchenko's more technical, but again, that forward pressure, aggressive style from Lee should take a lot of that technical ability away from Shevchenko. It should make the fight a little bit uglier, which plays into the game of Andrea Lee for sure. And then Andrea Lee, I think her wrestling to the eye is probably still a little better than Shevchenko, so she's probably got more chance of getting on top of Shevchenko and more chance of looking good. And like I've already said, if Andrea Lee is on her game here, she's not having an off night, if she comes in here hungry, aggressive, ready to go to war, I think she's got every chance of looking superb in this fight. I think that we are going to see that. We have to see that from Andrea Lee, because if she doesn't and she loses a fourth fight in a row, it's going to be trouble for her. I think that she comes out looking good in this fight, looking hungry and aggressive and putting that pressure on. That should be a bit of a nightmare stylistically for Shevchenko. For that reason, I'm picking Andrea Lee to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fun one here. We've got the Nightwolf versus the Beverly Hills Ninja. We've got Jamie Pickett versus Jordan Wright. On the betting line, we've got another picker, -110 on either side for either fighter. As for where the value is there, again, if you've got a good read on either side, the -110 is playable, again, as long as you have that good read. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think we see a little bit of fluctuation throughout fight week. It could potentially end up a -110 pick 'em on either side as they both step into the cage on Saturday night, but I do think at some point we might see a little bit of money coming in on Jordan Wright, pushing him to maybe -115, -120, the very slight favourite. As for how this fight plays out though, it's going to be a really fun fight in my opinion. I think it's going to be action packed. I think it's going to be won and lost on the feet. I'd be really surprised if either fighter was shooting for a takedown unless they were getting absolutely battered on the feet, then they just wanted to mix things up and try and take the fight somewhere else. But aside from that, I do think that the majority of this fight does play out on the feet. I think we see some big action strikes. I think we see an aggressive fight. And when we talk about aggression, I do think that this is one area where Pickett really struggles, and we saw that in his last fight against Chukwue, who actually showed against Jung Yong Park that he wasn't maybe the fighter that we thought he was right now. That's not to say he can't become great, but that loss for Chukwue last weekend definitely doesn't look great for Pickett in this spot right now. So I think that Pickett does have a problem with fighters being aggressive on him. And with saying that, I also think that Pickett's best work is done moving forwards as well. But in all fairness to him, when he is being pressured, he does counter aggressively, he does hit back hard, and that's what's going to make this fight fun. I just don't think that Pickett is anywhere near as effective moving backwards as he is moving forwards. Whereas with Jordan Wright, he's definitely an aggressive fighter that will push forwards. I think he will be the aggressor for the majority of this fight. I'm not going to say throughout the entire fight, because I do think Pickett's going to have moments, but I definitely think the pressure fighter is predominantly going to be Jordan Wright. And I think Jordan Wright's more versatile in his attacks. He's got good hands, he's got good kicks, he mixes things up a little bit better. I think he's going to be slightly better if both fighters tie up in the clinch and go against the cage as well. So although this fight is going to be close and both fighters are definitely going to have the moments and both fighters are aggressive in their own right, both fighters also hit really hard, and in a fight that's won and lost on the feet, that could usually play out where it might only just take one shot from either guy to end the night. But I think when you're looking at who the better fighter is overall, I just think that Jordan Wright does have more weapons in his arsenal. He is a little bit more versatile, and because of that, he mixes things up a little better in the cage. And as I do think that he will be the fighter that is moving forwards more often than he's moving backwards, I do have to favour him in this fight. So I'm picking Jordan, the Beverly Hills Ninja Wright, to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Gina Mazany versus Priscilla Cachoeira. Mazany is currently the -210 favourite. The comeback on Cachoeira at +175 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I actually don't think there's too much value, if I'm being honest, because I do get why Mazany is a -210 favourite for sure. But on the flip side to that, playing a 2-1 favourite at this level in the UFC UFC is very risky and it does come with a lot of concerns and a lot of red flags. So I don't think there's too much value, if I'm being honest. Like I say, I get the betting line, but it's also very risky at the same time. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I don't think it's going to move too much, to be honest. I don't think there's going to be a lot of action on this fight for the reasons that I've just mentioned, because I don't think people are going to be jumping to the betting window to take a plus 175 on Cachoeira, even though it's a nice line. Again, that bet itself's very risky, but on the flip side, as I've already mentioned, minus 210 on Mazany is a big line for a fight at this level in the UFC, so there might be a little bit of fluctuation here and there, but I don't think there's going to be too much action on this fight, and I think both fighters are going to step into the cage sitting roughly where they're at right about now on the betting line. As for how this fight plays out though, I think it's actually a decently matched fight, and it should be fun to watch as well, because Cachoeira, she is very aggressive. She comes forward, she'll eat 2, 3, 4 punches as long as it means that she can land one big one herself. She is really fun to watch. She's an entertaining fighter, and I do like it when she steps inside the cage and just comes forward almost like a zombie and just looks to land anything that she can. The thing is with Mazany, although that Mazany will succumb to that a little bit in this fight, I do think Cachoeira will have her moments. I think the moments will come few and far between though, because when Cachoeira is coming forwards, Mazany's just going to tie up with her. She's going to slow the fight down. She's going to use her physicality and her pressure and aggression to turn Cachoeira, put Cachoeira's back on the cage and look to maybe trip and take her down. I think if Mazany can take Cachoeira down, I think she'll be able to keep her down long enough, establish a top position to be winning moments in the rounds and potentially win the rounds that she's on top as well. And if she doesn't take her down, I think that she'll be able to press her against the cage and again just run the clock down a little bit, do just enough inside the clinch for the referee not to really split them up and the judges just to be scoring to her, because they have to be scoring one way. I feel like Mazany's going to try and make this fight dirty, ugly and grindy, whereas Cachoeira's just going to try and land everything humanly possible on her. But ultimately the dirty, ugly, grinding style of Mazany is the one that's going to be prominent in this fight and is going to be the difference between a win and a loss. For that reason, I'm picking Gina Mazany to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the return of Kevin Aguilar versus the newcomer Tucker Lutz. Tucker Lutz is currently the minus 120 favourite to come back on Aguilar at plus 100 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I've said this a few times already in this episode of the podcast. If you've got a good read on either side here, then either side is playable at the current lines. If you like Tucker Lutz, then minus 120 is playable. If you like Aguilar, then plus 100 is obviously playable as well. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think it's going to be another one of those fights that doesn't have a ton of action coming in on either side. I do expect a little bit of money on either side throughout fight week, obviously, but I don't think it's going to be enough to make this line fly one way or another. So come Saturday night when they both step into the cage, I do expect the betting lines to be sitting roughly where they're at right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, Kevin Aguilar, again for me, he's just looked a little underwhelming lately. He's on a 3-fight losing streak. Dan Igue's no shame in losing to him, but the way he lost to Takugov and the way he lost to Charles Rosa just don't really scream anything massively positive coming from Aguilar. He's really got to turn things around here, because he came into the UFC as a stern, solid fighter that people had high hopes for. And although he came into the UFC and opened up 2-0 against Rick Glenn and Enrique Barzola, he's not just been able to simply replicate those performances in his later fights. He's got to do that here, and I do think this is an important fight for him to get a win, because if he doesn't, then he could potentially be looking at the chopping block. And Tucker Lutz is not going to be an easy fight for him. The UFC have given Aguilar no favours with this fight whatsoever. Lutz has got a wrestling background. I'm not sure how effective that's going to be in this fight, because the one elite area of Aguilar is his takedown defense. He's very hard to take down, and if you do take him down, he's got good scrambles and he can get back up to his feet as well. And on the flip side to that anyway, it does look like Lutz has fell in love with his striking. He's got a kickboxing background. He seems to like throwing strikes and looking for the knockout, opposed to just being relentless with the wrestling. And as I mentioned, I don't think that's a bad thing for Lutz in this fight either, because he could end up expending a lot of energy trying to take Aguilar down and being unsuccessful doing so. So I do think this is a fight that's going to be won and lost on the feet. And I do think the volume's going to be pretty close, even though Aguilar, I do want to see more volume from him. He can be a little low volume, but I think that these two fighters are going to to clash inside boxing range. They both love fighting at the same range, which, like I said, is inside that boxing range. So for me, the winner is going to be the fighter who's quicker. It's going to be the fighter who's willing to put out more volume, the fighter that's willing to go longer with the combinations, and the fighter that's landing the harder, cleaner strikes. And honestly, this fight could be very close because of that, but I do lean towards Tucker Lutz because I do like his combinations. They are clean, they are crisp. He throws with intent to be effective, and you can make the same arguments over for Kevin Aguilar as well. He's also a crisp striker. He's also really durable. You know, he's got that Mexican blood. It's really tough to knock that dude out. So credit to Takugov for what he did, but I just think Lutz is going to land a slightly more volume here. I do like his technique a little bit more than Aguilar's, and with the technique, he throws in combinations, and I just feel that he's going to look better inside those exchanges. And I think that Aguilar, the more he gets hit, the more he's gonna start moving backwards a little bit, the more he's gonna start doubting himself in the cage, because he's on a 3-fight losing streak. So there's a mental perspective to this fight as well. I think Tucker Lutz is going to be aggressive. He's going to look to come forward. I think he's definitely going to get a hit from Aguilar. Aguilar's going to have his moments, but I think the better moments, the bigger action moments, are going to come from Tucker Lutz. So I'm going to pick Tucker Lutz to win this fight. And in the final fight, the final breakdown of this episode, we've got the returning Sean Soriano versus Christos Iagos. Iagos is currently the -220 favourite to come back on Soriano at +180 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think that the line is fairly accurate, if I'm being honest. If you are pushing me for a value side, I would say that Iagos at -220 is probably the better bet than Soriano at +180. But like I said, I think the books have got this right. I think the line is very fair, it's very accurate. As for where the line moves throughout fight week, honestly, I think there's going to be a little bit of fluctuation. I think people might see some things in Iagos that I'm going to talk about that might make them want to bet Soriano at +180. But ultimately, I think if people are looking at which fighter is the better fighter, then they might edge towards betting Iagos. Ultimately, when both of these fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, I don't expect the betting lines to be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out, the first thing I'm going to touch upon, and I have mentioned this briefly when I said that some people might see things in Iagos that might make them want to bet Soriano, is the cardio of Iagos. Now, this is something that I know people have been speaking about for a very long time, and I wasn't sold on it initially, but honestly, if you go back and look at all Iagos' recent fights, he starts really fast, he's really great in the early rounds, but he does fade in every single fight to the point where he is very gassed in round 3. The good thing about Iagos is he's so well-rounded, he's such a good striker, he's powerful, he's got good combinations, he's got good wrestling, good takedowns, good top control, and he's got good chain wrestling if the fighter stands back up after that initial takedown as well. He's got such a good, well-rounded, effective game that he can bank 2 rounds before he gasses and goes into the 3rd round, just looking to survive and to hang on. The problem is with Iagos is if he does end up losing one of those first 2 rounds, then winning on the scorecards is going to be very difficult for him, and he's not so much of a finisher. Like, you look at the fight against Carlton Minus, and he should have absolutely been finishing that fight, and he had plenty of opportunities to do so, and he didn't. So the fact is, if you can take one of the early rounds against him, you're going to put yourself in a really good position to win the fight and beating Iagos. The thing is with Sean Soriano, although he's an aggressive fighter, he comes forward, he likes to put pressure on his opponents, wing big shots, he will look for takedowns as well, he will try and mix things up. But the problem that I've got with Soriano is from a defensive perspective. I've seen enough in tape to know that Iagos is going to have success in the earlier rounds in this fight, and Soriano might be able to take over late if he's not tired himself. But I've seen Soriano taken down, I've seen him cracked hard, I've seen him be able to be clinched up with, and these are all the things that Iagos is going to look to do inside the cage. I think Iagos is going to have an edge in the striking. I think he's the better wrestler. I think that he can take Soriano down, and I'm not convinced Soriano is going to be able to get back up to his feet easily, and if he does, I just think he'll get taken down again, and that will happen for 2 rounds, and then Iagos will start to tire, and if Soriano isn't tired from everything that's happened, then Soriano might be able to come back in round 3, but it's probably unlikely that he's going to find a finish, so Iagos will win 29-28 on the scorecards. It seems to be a current theme with these Christos Iagos fights, and I feel like this this is going to be another one of those fights. Sure, Soriano's going to have his moments. He's back in the UFC. He's going to be hyped. He's going to come out fast and hard. He's going to be excited. But ultimately, I just feel that Giagos is the better fighter in the striking. He has an edge there. I think he's got an edge in the wrestling. And if he can get on top of Soriano, I think he's going to be able to establish a solid top position, grind rounds out, take the first two, and then whatever happens in round 3 happens. But I don't think a finish happens, so Giagos would win anyway. And it's for those reasons I'm picking Christos Giagos to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Moneyline. I hope you all enjoyed it, and as always, fight fans, I'd appreciate all the likes to the video and subscriptions to our MMA Play 365 YouTube channel too. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAplay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot, fun parlays or ACCAs, accumulators as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, which comes with a money back guarantee, by the way, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, which also includes our DFS packages for DraftKings and FanDuel too. All of our subscriptions are very affordable. Just hop on to MMAplay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.